Today we're marking the 25th anniversary of the world premiere of Brian Friel's Translations. Produced by Field Day Theatre Company, the play received its grand opening in Derry's Guildhall, a venue that at the time was more associated with unionist control than with the hedge school setting of Friel's now iconic play. I've been talking to actor Stephen Rea, one of the founding members of the Field Day Theatre Company, and I asked him about his decision to form the company with Brian Friel.
Well, I'd worked with Brian. I did Freedom of the City at the Royal Court. That was kind of a big moment for me, you know. And then I only saw him once between then and 1979, and then I decided I'd like to start something in the North, and who better to go to than Brian? And I went to him. Everybody has to make a pilgrimage once in their lives, and I made mine, and he gave me the play. It was that simple.
The play being Translations.
Yeah. Of course, it's a groundbreaking, wonderful play, but he hadn't written it when we met, and he did say that possibly the fact that he was writing it for this new company might have influenced the outcome in some way.
And at that stage, he was changing. His writing was changing to an extent. He was moving out of the private, out of the Philadelphia Here I Come period, if you like, into something far more public with Freedom of the City, and he was continuing that then with Translations.
Well, we were all changing. We'd arrived at this crisis in the North. Everybody was changed. The impact was of the collapse of that society, which is what happened in 1969. You couldn't be untouched by it. Everybody was affected and, in some sense, maimed by it. You had to have a response, and if you were in the business of theatre or writing or acting, you had to attempt a principled response.
And when you approached him, did he have something like Translations in mind? And how do you think it might have changed because he decided then to write it for a company like Field Day?
He certainly had it in his mind. I know that he was working on something. He said, I'm working on something. And I later found out that it was about the whole ordnance survey and that whole area. I'm not suggesting that it suddenly had a profoundly different effect on what he wrote, but that I think it may have given it an edge, an understanding that there was an audience that was going to be different. And it's interesting, really, subsequent productions, if you take away that very engaged audience in Derry and subsequently throughout the country, it has been seen in a less political light.
Hard to see how you would see a play like Translations in a less political light.
I haven't. I've been told this. Subsequent productions at the Abbey just had less political edge.
What do you think? What was it?
I mean, it's possible to see it. Love story. You know, I mean, you can. Any different productions focus on different things. The context for our production was essentially political.
But you say
the Guildhall,
yeah,
Derry.
Absolutely. But out of that context, it can become Romeo and Juliet. It can become the Montagues and the Capulets rather than the Irish and the English.
Yeah, well, we never wanted it to be a plague on both their houses. That's a cul-de-sac for me.
In what sense? Just tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, then you wash your hands off the whole thing. You say, well, life is terrible. There are these two warring tribes, and they end up hurting each other. What and under God are we going to do? It's not enough, in my view. And that's why Field Day became more and more engaged in really getting to the root of what was causing the hurt.
Obviously, it was a highly charged period, a highly emotive period. It was a period of disillusionment with politics in Northern Ireland. I mean, you mentioned the word cul-de-sac yourself. It seemed to be one huge cul-de-sac out of which nobody was able to extract themselves. And do you think in that context that people turned more to things like Field Day, to phenomena like Field Day, and the idea of culture as being an alternative to politics?
Well, I wouldn't have seen it as an alternative to politics, but just a fresh energy. It wasn't that politics had failed, it was just a disaster. I mean, there were no normal politics in the North. That's why people ended up on the streets. There was no agency for change that a normal society would have. as soon as people suggested the notion of civil rights, they were battened off the streets. As soon as change was offered as a possibility, you had violence. What we were trying to do was to get right back before the violence, to talk why are we here? Well, how did we get to this situation? I think people found that to be a relief. There was a way of discussing things. As I said before, where there was a way of negotiating opposing positions which wasn't confrontational necessarily. You know. So, as you say, after 11 years of this, and as has been noted, if something lasts for 10 years, it can last 100 years. Something had to be done. And I think that we, although, as I've said, it was an instinctive response to the problem, I think the instincts were very honed through the experience of living in that situation, and that we tried to work out a way of talking about things.
Did you talk to Friel? Did you have conversations like this conversation with Brian Friel?
Constantly. During our most creative times, Brian and I would talk every day on the phone. If we weren't in direct physical contact, we'd talk every day. And it may seem like a small amount of work for a lot of talk, but I think the quality of the work was a result of the constant debate.
Also, it was important from a dramatic point of view as well as from a political point of view, in that, to a certain extent, it subverted the trend of major Irish plays going to England to be produced, and also, I suppose, the trend which saw Irish plays being produced with, in some sense, an English production in mind, even if they weren't actually premiered in England.
No, well, we used to say that we were doing it for ourselves and we didn't mind if anybody else overheard us, but that it was absolutely for ourselves. Yeah, I think we subverted the notion that plays are frivolous confection, that you can do something that's highly entertaining and be saying something at the same time. So something I'm proud of is that when we did Derek Mahon's version of and Tom Pollan's version of Antigone, the two classical verse plays translated by two modern Irish poets.
One very serious, one very funny.
Very funny. There were queues around the block. And I don't think there's many queues around the block for verse plays.
Tell us a little bit of your memories of the opening night of translations in Derry and of the mood in the city.
Well, it was a weird mood, you know. People didn't do plays in Derry. I mean, amateurs did plays in Derry, but big professional productions where major national critics were going to appear, and with actors who didn't have to be working in Derry. They could be working in Dublin, they could be working in London. That wasn't the norm. So it was a kind of a shock, and it was very exciting. And Derry was very keen to have this production. You know, the people in the city council were very, very keen on it. And of course, in some sense, it did turn things around.
And the Guildhall as a venue, probably not the best.
No, it's an unspeakable venue. But there is a way to use it, actually. But we were never let use it because of the fire authorities wouldn't let us put seats where we wanted to. I mean, it's interesting how important that evening may be, is that the next year when we opened Three Sisters, on the opening night, and Tom Pollan has written about this, a British Army helicopter flew over the Guildhall and hovered above the Guildhall and drowned out the performance. Interesting that it was considered that important.
And what do you think it did for Derry? What do you think, just translations alone, that opening night of translations when Derry, you know, put on its posh frock for the rest of the world, in a sense, and showed what it could do?
Well, it showed that Derry could do something other than just resist, that it could face things in a mature way, and that there was a debate within that community that they were willing to have, and there was a chink of light, I think.
But even by staging it in Derry, you were making a different kind of a statement. You were making a cultural political statement as well, which is that a major play by a major playwright, performed by major actors, doesn't have to open in Dublin, in London, or even in Belfast.
No, and a certain amount of the motivation would have been that Derry had been refused everything. It had lost the university to Coleraine, and that was part of the whole civil rights problem. Derry had huge unemployment. It had suffered as much from the Troubles, from the period leading up to the Troubles, as anywhere. And there was a belief that it was an important cultural statement to make, to go there. That was, of course, resented very much by particularly Belfast, actually. But it was right to focus there at that time.
And touring was an extension of that logic, not just touring to Dublin and Belfast and London, but touring to Enniskillen, for example, touring to places which wouldn't, at that time, necessarily have had what you would describe as professional theatrical venues. Most of them do now, but they didn't at the time.
No, they didn't at the time. You played in school halls, and in Enniskillen, as you mentioned, actually, it was so packed that they ended up just handing out chairs to people as they walked in the door and taking money, and they just sat wherever they could. It was exhilarating in that way because you saw a need for theatre that you don't see in a so-called metropolis. People don't have to get in a car and drive to Dublin, drive to Belfast. They actually walk out of their own homes and go and see something happening in front of them. Therefore, the communication is different. They don't come to us saying, oh, be nice to know what you're doing. We come to them saying, we want to know what you feel. So it was amazingly important.
And tell me about the importance then of the formation of the Field Day Board in 1981 and the composition of the board. The fact that there were 3 Catholics, there were 3 Protestants. Was that deliberate?
No, I don't think that was deliberate. I mean, it looks deliberate, but I think it was just they were the right people. And I think that's more important. We decided, Brian and I had to have a board because we become a company with charitable status, all that
company
stuff.
Limited under guarantee.
Or whatever, I'm not good at that stuff. But so we decided to have people who might have input rather than people who would just sit on the board and smile and say, well done. We had people who would challenge us, who might move the thing on a bit, and not just theatre people. And I mean, Dean and Heaney picked themselves, really, and Paul was less well known at that time, but he was writing very interesting stuff. And David Hammond was David Hammond.
And the meetings themselves, apparently, to an outsider, they would have looked disorganised, shall we say. I mean, I don't think was there ever a proper chairperson?
We always sat in the same place around the table. That was traditional. Dean always took the minutes. They were hilarious. And we just talked. And it wasn't kind of mind-blowing every meeting, but things were teased out very meticulously. And when you've got men of the intellectual capacity of Dean, Friel, Heaney, Paul, and eventually Tom Kilroy, you get somewhere. You start to have an identity, and it's a completely other thing. I feel this is the problem. The Abbey is always struggling. I think the Abbey has to get the intellectuals, the writers, around a table and talking about what the hell the nation is. If we're a national theatre, what is the nation? What do we want to do?
Well, perhaps with the new structure that may be possible. Perhaps it wasn't possible in the past.
Yeah, I certainly hope so, because there's no other way.
And when those heavyweights came on board, did it in any sense change the philosophy of Field Day? Did it change the direction of Field Day? Because it had started with 2 people, now you've got the vision of 6 people, and then subsequently Tom Kilroy.
Yeah, well, Tom Kilroy himself said, there were as many political positions around that table as there were people. It was difficult to imagine it as just a cohesive, deterministic movement. We weren't that. Everything was discussed. People disagreed terribly about things.
What were the major disagreements?
I'll tell you one disagreement because it's against me in a way, but when we did the pamphlets, there was one series and we included a unionist politician in writing one of the pamphlets, and I didn't really see why, because he was adequately represented. He had access to all kinds of media and spoke in a very loud voice very often. And I thought, well, we're not Hyde Park Corner, we shouldn't. Why would we waste time with this guy? Other people thought we should. That's all. There were disagreements like that.
And was that something that, I mean, that was something that Field Day was accused of, that it took one side of the political divide and that it only approached one side of the political divide. I mean, your justification would be, well, that was a side that didn't have a voice up to that.
Didn't have a voice, but the point about it is that any new ideas in the north of Ireland were always seen as a nationalist plot. That's the nature of it, because they proposed change. Change threatened one side and didn't threaten the other. One of the disappointing and depressing things about Derry was when the whole thing came up about building a theatre in Derry. That was going to be built on the city side, that is the Catholic side. That was going to be balanced by a leisure centre being built on the water side, i.e. the Protestant side, because the Protestant people didn't have an interest in theatre, it seemed. Now, the reason for that would be that theatre does propose change. It's ambiguous. It can be frightening because it isn't one idea hammered through. And I don't think Field Day was ever one idea, all of us behind one idea. We started from a position of, look, we want to do a play in Derry. We want to be Derry-based. We don't want to be establishment. We want to be outside the metropolis. All of those things were threatening to people who resist change.
Did you, in any sense, though, move from being a theatre of one idea to being a theatre of ideas?
Yes, I think we were a theatre of ideas. That's our achievement, to show that that's possible. Again, I think the original Abbey was a theatre of ideas. Because when you've got writers, what else are you going to get? Writers are naturally people who won't be happy with one fixed position. Friel changed his position. I mean, Communication Cord was a response to the response to translations, because people believed in the pieties of translations, and he hated that. So he wrote this debunking comedy.
A very impious piece of work, all right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So because the writer will never stay in one position.
You were also, I mean, you were criticised politically repeatedly. You were also criticised from a cultural point of view. For example, there were a lot of female voices raised against what would have been the perception of Field Day as being very masculine.
Yeah, well, we had 6 and eventually 7 men on the board. I can't defend it, except that we couldn't identify a woman at that time that we wanted to sit on the board. Perhaps we could now, but at that time, no. And in the end, I don't think that should be the issue. You know.
And in terms of publications, obviously there was an outcry when the Field Day anthology came out. But that was something that you, I don't think, were that close to, the literary side of things.
Well, I was on the board that approved the publication, and
so you share responsibility.
Of course, I share responsibility. I don't. It's interesting that I feel a lot of that criticism came from particular places, and the initial attempt to criticise the anthology would have been about lack of inclusiveness in terms of the unionist community. But in fact, we did include unionists. Even Ian Paisley's in the anthology under the political speeches section. There was criticism that we hadn't included enough women, or the right women. And we remedied that by publishing a 4th volume, which included practically every woman who ever wrote anything. And indeed, Eileen Battersby has commented herself, saying the early volume wasn't as remiss as it seemed at the time. So these things, there was an attack on the anthology, and there would have been a considered attack whatever we'd done.
The term the fifth province was tossed around a lot. Explain the notion of the fifth province.
Well, it's not a Field Day original phrase. It's from Cranberg, isn't it? But what I think it adequately describes is an organisation that can be above politics and still be about politics. a province of the mind and of the imagination. And I particularly like it because I think that's what Field Day was, because to describe us as narrowly nationalist is inappropriate.
So you think Field Day did get above politics, but it was still about politics? Because you are a very political animal.
Me personally, I have absolutely no specific political involvement in anything.
So in that sense,
I don't belong to any political party. I have a political experience. I don't have a political agenda. I have an agenda as an actor and as someone working in theatre and film, but I don't have any political agenda.
Are you a bit like, you talked about Friel moving on from translations to the communication cord. Do you move on? Do you have not necessarily a specific political agenda, but shifting political agendas?
Our group, we did Cura Troy, we did Pentecost. Both of those are plays which urge people to move on from fixed positions. We did that long before ceasefires. You know, at the end of Pentecost, the sun rises and people are reconciled, which is a kind of crazy aspiration in 1989, was it? And yet it happened. I'm not saying we caused it, but that's what we wrote about. That's what we aspired to.
Do you think that the political perception of Field Day wasn't helped very much by the fact that it almost exactly coincided with the beginning of one of the most horrendous periods in Northern history, and that was the period of the hunger strikes?
I'm aware that the hunger strikes happened at that time. You know, I didn't see them as specifically affecting our work. Our work was about something else. I do see the Troubles as something that was inevitable, really. I think after Bloody Sunday, certain things were inevitable. In the same way as after the famine, the War of Independence was inevitable. Things happen. They don't just go away. And all I can say is that our efforts were to find ways to change things, to move things away from this. And that's what happened.
How do you think the notion of a theatre of ideas stands in the year 2005, 25 years after the creation of Field Day?
Well, it's the only theatre that's of any interest, isn't it? Really? I mean, ideas are what move us on. We're living with ideas that are ancient. It's time for new ideas all the time.
But are we being sufficiently exposed to new ideas through theatre, or even ideas, even old ideas?
No, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Abbey happened in 1904 as a period of immense turmoil and flux. We started to work when society was in collapse in the north. We've got a very complacent society now in Ireland, and they fear ideas more than anything. But somebody has to identify what the ideas are now that are going to change things, that are going to challenge things.
What's the legacy of Field Day, do you think?
Well, that's the legacy, as far as I can see, is that a theatre of ideas is possible, even in the most difficult of circumstances. That people want to see things discussed. The theatre has a purpose.
And what's the future of Field Day?
Well, the future of Field Day will be in publications without question, and is at the moment involved in publications, because the only two active members now are myself and Seamus Dean. But it has been proposed to me that we do one last Field Day tour, and we may do that.
And
that's all I can say.
You're not going to say any more than that? No idea what the play might be?
No idea at all.
Nothing in mind? Just the notion of a Field Day tour?
Just the notion of one last Field Day tour.
Stephen Rea, thank you very much for talking to us.